They laughed when Jon Stewart called her a Gen Z Trump doll on live TV. Mocking her youth and small-town roots, Karoline Leavitt sat still, her eyes steady, not a flicker of fear. The audience thought she was outmatched, a nobody against a legend, but they didn't know she'd spent weeks digging, holding a truth that could turn the stage silent. So, when does a small-town staffer become the one who changes the story? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The studio lights of The Daily Show burned bright, casting sharp shadows across the sleek black stage in New York City. Karoline Leavitt sat on a stiff chair, her navy blazer slightly creased from the long day. She was 30, but her freckled face and soft blonde ponytail made her look younger, too young. Some whispered. For the political firestorm she'd walked into, Jon Stewart, perched behind his desk, tilted his head with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Karoline," he began, his voice smooth as whiskey. "You're the Gen Z Trump doll, right? Signal leaks and all." The audience erupted in laughter, a wave of sound that hit Karoline like a gust of cold wind. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened briefly. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, every camera lens zooming in, waiting for her to crumble. She didn't. Her hazel eyes, steady and unblinking, met Stewart's. There was something in them, something the crowd couldn't name. But it wasn't fear. Stewart leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "I mean, come on," he said, gesturing to the audience. "You're what? 25. Defending a guy who can't even spell signal." The crowd roared again, clapping like trained seals. Karoline's chest tightened, not from the insult, but from the familiarity of it. She'd been here before. Small-town New Hampshire, high school debates, college panels, always the girl they thought they could dismiss. Her fingers brushed the silver ring on her right hand, a gift from her mentor, a journalist who taught her to fight with truth, not temper. She'd promised him she'd never back down. Not tonight, not ever. A woman in the front row, clutching a notepad, watched Karoline closely, her pen hovering over the page. Was she a reporter? A critic? Karoline couldn't tell. But the woman's gaze felt different, less mocking, more curious. The rest of the audience, though, was Stewart's. They laughed when he called her a walking bumper sticker, their cheers drowning out the faint unease in Karoline's stomach. She wasn't here to win their love. She was here to speak, to stand for something bigger than herself. But Stewart wasn't done. "Karoline, seriously," he said, his tone sharpening. "You're out here defending free speech while your buddies leak private messages. That's rich." The accusation landed hard, and the crowd hooted, some standing to clap. Karoline's lips curved, not into a smile, but something quieter, something resolute. She thought of her mentor's words. "They'll laugh until they can't." Her heart beat steady, though her palms were damp. She wasn't just a staffer, a nobody from a small town. She carried a truth they didn't expect, a weapon they hadn't seen. The cameras kept rolling. The audience kept laughing. But a few faces in the crowd shifted, less certain, less amused. The woman with the notepad scribbled something, her eyes flicking between Karoline and Stewart. Backstage, a producer whispered to a colleague, "She's not biting. What's her deal?" Karoline heard none of it. She sat still, her silence louder than the noise around her. If you've ever been laughed at for who you are, for what you believe, this moment was for you. Karoline wasn't here to play their game. She was here to change it. The stage was set. The trap laid. But traps work both ways. Stewart thought he had her cornered. A young woman out of her depth. A punching bag for his wit. He didn't know what she carried in her pocket, in her heart. The segment was far from over, and the air in the studio felt heavier now, like the calm before a storm. What was she waiting for? A chance to speak or something sharper? Something that would cut through the laughter and leave the room silent. The studio of The Daily Show in New York City hummed with a restless energy, the air thick with the aftertaste of Jon Stewart's biting wit. Karoline Leavitt sat under the unforgiving glare of the stage lights, her navy blazer absorbing the heat, her blonde ponytail catching a faint shimmer. The laughter from the audience still echoed, though it had softened into a murmur, like a wave retreating from the shore. Stewart, leaning back in his chair, scribbled something on a note card, his smirk lingering as if he'd already won. Karoline's hands rested in her lap, her fingers brushing the cool surface of an old silver ring on her right hand. It was a gift from her mentor, a grizzled journalist named Tom Hargrove, who'd spent decades chasing truth in small-town papers before cancer took him. Facts don't shout, he'd told her once, his voice rough but kind. They wait. She was waiting now. Karoline's silence wasn't the kind that comes from fear. It was deliberate, a choice carved from years of being underestimated. In her hometown of Atkinson, New Hampshire, she'd been the girl who didn't fit, too outspoken for the quiet streets, too conservative for the liberal college she'd attended. She'd learned early that arguing with a crowd rarely changed minds. Instead, she listened, watched, and prepared. Tonight, she felt the familiar ache in her chest, not from Stewart's barbs, but from the weight of being unseen. He'd called her a Gen Z Trump doll, a cheap shot that stung because it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who'd ever been dismissed for their beliefs, their age, their roots. Her hazel eyes flicked to the audience, scanning the sea of faces. Most were still chuckling, caught in Stewart's spell, but a few looked uneasy, their smiles faltering. A woman in the front row, maybe in her 50s, clutched a notepad, her pen hovering over the page. Her glasses slipped down her nose as she stared at Karoline, her expression unreadable. Was she a journalist? A skeptic waiting to tear Karoline apart, or someone who saw something the others didn't? Karoline felt the woman's gaze like a tether, a quiet anchor in the storm. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. Backstage, a producer in a headset leaned toward a colleague, his voice low. "She's done for. No comeback from that." The colleague nodded, but his eyes lingered on Karoline. Curious, they thought her silence was defeat. A young woman out of her depth on national television. They didn't know she'd spent months preparing, digging through archives, saving files, waiting for a moment like this. Karoline's heart beat steady. Though her palms were damp, she thought of Tom, his wrinkled hands pressing the ring into hers before he passed. "Wear it when you need courage," he'd said. She needed it now, not because she doubted herself, but because the stakes were bigger than one interview. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for the people who'd sent her messages, who'd prayed for her, who'd told her to keep fighting. Stewart's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and playful. "So, Karoline, what's it like working for a guy who thinks Signal is a cereal brand?" The audience laughed again, but it was thinner this time, less certain. Karoline didn't respond. She let the words hang, let the room feel the weight of her stillness. Her fingers traced the ring's edge, grounding her. If you've ever stood alone, knowing you're more than what they see, you'd know why Karoline didn't speak. She wasn't here to trade insults or win a shouting match. She was here to shift something deeper, something that would outlast the laughter. The woman with the notepad tilted her head, her pen scratching softly. a man in the back row, his arms crossed, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. The studio felt smaller now, the air charged with something unspoken. Stewart shuffled his note cards, his grin a little tighter. He thought he was in control, that Karoline's silence was her surrender. But silence can be a weapon. 2. In her pocket, her phone held a file of video, a truth she'd kept close. The segment was far from over, and the laughter wouldn't last. What was she waiting for? The right moment. Or something more. The Daily Show's studio in New York City pulsed with a restless hum, the kind that settles over a crowd hungry for a knockout. The sleek black stage reflected the harsh lights, and Karoline Leavitt sat at its center, her navy blazer a stark contrast to the glossy set. Jon Stewart, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a man who'd never lost on this stage, leaned forward, his voice thick with condescension. Karoline, you defend free speech, but your party's all about control, isn't it? The words hit like a well-aimed dart, and the audience erupted. Their cheers a wall of sound that pressed against Karoline's chest. She felt it tighten, not from fear, but from the clarity of the moment. This was the trap, the one she'd seen coming since she'd agreed to this interview. Stewart wasn't just mocking her. He was trying to unravel everything she stood for. Karoline's hazel eyes met his, steady and unyielding. She nodded slightly, a small gesture that seemed to say, "Go on. Keep digging." To the crowd, it looked like surrender, but it was anything but. She'd learned long ago, in the quiet debates of her New Hampshire hometown, that reacting too fast gave your opponent the upper hand. Her fingers, resting in her lap, brushed the silver ring on her right hand, the one Tom Hargrove had given her. "Wait for the moment," he'd said, his voice raspy from years of chain smoking. "Then strike with truth." She was waiting now, her pulse quickening, not from doubt, but from the weight of what she carried. In her pocket, her phone held a file of video, a piece of evidence she'd guarded like a secret. She hadn't planned to use it, not at first, but Stewart was pushing her to the edge. The audience, still riding the wave of Stewart's jab, clapped and hooted. A man in the third row shouted, "Get her." Jon and the laughter swelled. Stewart, sensing victory, pressed harder. Come on, Karoline," he said, spreading his hands as if addressing a child. "You're a walking contradiction. Free speech one day, signal leaks the next. How do you sleep at night?" The accusation was sharper this time, slicing through the air. The crowd roared, some standing, their faces alight with the thrill of watching a takedown. A stagehand in the shadows snickered, his arms crossed. But Karoline caught another movement, a woman in the front row, the one with the notepad, frowning as she scribbled faster. Her glasses glinted under the lights, and her pen moved with purpose. Was she seeing something the others missed? Karoline didn't know. But that frown felt like a crack in the room's certainty. Karoline's heart raced, not from the insults, but from the choice she faced. She could argue, throw back a clever retort, try to match Stewart's wit, but words alone wouldn't shift this crowd. They were his, bought and paid for with years of his charm. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let Stewart's words hang like smoke. Her fingers grazed her phone through the fabric of her pocket, the weight of the file grounding her. It was a clip from 2018, one she'd found after weeks of digging through old interviews. She'd watched it late at night in her small apartment, the screen's glow illuminating her face as Stewart's own words betrayed him. She hadn't wanted to use it, not out of kindness, but because she'd hoped he'd fight fair. He hadn't. Stewart, misreading her silence, leaned back with a grin. "What? No defense? Come on, Karoline, give us something." The audience laughed again, but it was thinner now, less sure. A few faces in the crowd shifted, their eyes flicking between Karoline and Stewart. The woman with the notepad stopped writing. Her gaze locked on Karoline, as if sensing a shift. Backstage, the producer whispered to his colleague, "She's got nothing. Segment's almost done." But Karoline's nod hadn't been surrender, it was permission. Permission for Stewart to overplay his hand. To think he'd won. Her chest ached, not from his words, but from the memory of every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd been told she didn't belong. This wasn't just about her. It was about the people who'd trusted her, who'd believed she could stand up to a giant. If you've ever been pushed to the edge, knowing one wrong move could cost you everything, you'd understand why Karoline didn't speak. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest. She was here to expose a truth, one that would outlast the cheers. The segment was nearing its end, and Stewart was ready to declare victory, his note cards neatly stacked, his smirk firmly in place. But Karoline's next move wasn't scripted. Her hand rested near her pocket, her eyes never leaving Stewart's. The room felt smaller now, the air taut with anticipation. Would she dare? Would she pull the trigger on a truth that could change everything? The crowd held its breath, though they didn't know why. The Daily Show's studio in New York City felt like a pressure cooker, the air heavy with the fading echoes of laughter. The sleek black stage gleamed under the harsh lights, and Karoline Leavitt sat at its heart, her navy blazer slightly rumpled, her blonde ponytail catching a faint glow. Jon Stewart, still perched behind his desk, had just landed what he thought was the killing blow, calling her a walking contradiction. The audience had cheered, their voices a tidal wave, but now they were quiet, waiting for Karoline to buckle. She didn't. Her hazel eyes, sharp and unyielding, held Stewart's gaze, and for the first time, his smirk flickered. Karoline's voice, calm but firm, sliced through the lingering chuckles. "John, can we play a clip?" The words were simple, almost polite, but they carried a weight that made the room pause. Stewart, caught off guard, raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "Sure. Kid, your funeral." The audience tittered, expecting another misstep. Karoline nodded to a stagehand, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest. She felt the silver ring on her right hand, the one Tom Hargrove had given her, its cool metal grounding her. Tom had taught her to fight with evidence, not emotion, and she'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. The studio screen flickered, and a grainy clip from 2018 filled it. Jon Stewart, younger but unmistakable, speaking at a media conference. "Social media's a mess," he said on the screen, his voice earnest. "We need censorship to protect democracy from bad actors." Gasps rippled through the audience, soft at first, then louder, like a wave breaking. Karoline's eyes locked on Stewart's, unwavering. "You called me a contradiction." "John," she said, her voice steady as stone. "What do you call that?" The room froze, the air sucked out in an instant. Stewart's face twitched, his smirk collapsing into something unreadable. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his hands fumbling with his note cards. "Well, that's... context matters," he stammered, forcing a laugh. "Come on, that's not the same thing." But the joke fell flat, landing like a stone in a still pond. The audience, once his loyal chorus, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Karoline and the screen. The woman in the front row, the one with the notepad, leaned forward, her glasses glinting as her pen scratched furiously. Her face was alight, not with amusement, but with something else. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Karoline felt her gaze, a quiet lifeline in the chaos. She wasn't just a small-town staffer, a nobody from New Hampshire. She was a woman who'd done her homework, who'd carried Tom's lessons like a torch. The clip looped silently on the screen. Stewart's own words damning him. Karoline didn't need to say more. She let the truth breathe. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd done. She'd taken a risk, a leap that could have backfired. If the clip hadn't landed, if the audience had laughed it off, she'd have been buried. But they didn't laugh. They murmured, some nodding, others frowning as they processed the disconnect. Stewart had built his career on calling out hypocrisy. But now the mirror was turned on him. Karoline's chest ached, not from pride, but from the memory of every time she'd been dismissed by professors, by peers, by people who thought her beliefs made her less. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd been told they didn't belong. Backstage, a producer muttered to a colleague, "Where the hell did she get that?" The colleague shook his head, his eyes wide. "We didn't vet her enough." A young intern, barely 20, watched from the shadows, her hands clasped tightly. She'd been silent all night, fetching coffee and running errands. But now her eyes were on Karoline, bright with something like awe. The audience's whispers grew louder, a hum of uncertainty. A man in the back row, his arms crossed, uncrossed them and leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The room was shifting, the tide turning. But it wasn't over. Stewart cleared his throat, his voice tighter now. "Okay, Karoline, nice try," he said, forcing a grin. "But you're dodging the real issue here. Your party's leaks, let's talk about that." He was deflecting, trying to regain control, but his hands betrayed him, shuffling his note cards too fast. If you've ever stood up to someone who thought they owned the room, you'd know why Karoline's hands trembled. Just for a moment, she wasn't here to gloat or to destroy Stewart. She was here to expose a truth, to make the crowd think. The clip was just the beginning, a crack in the facade. She had more. If she needed it, other files, other truths, but she didn't want to bury him. She wanted him to see her, to see the people she spoke for. The woman with the notepad was writing again, her pen a steady rhythm. The intern backstage shifted, her eyes never leaving Karoline. The segment was far from over, and the real fight was just beginning. Stewart thought he could laugh this off, but the room wasn't laughing anymore. What would he do next? And what was Karoline holding back? The Daily Show's studio in New York City crackled with a new kind of energy, the kind that comes when a room realizes it's been wrong. The black stage, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the flickering studio lights, and Karoline Leavitt sat at its center, her navy blazer absorbing the heat. The screen behind her still glowed with the frozen image of Jon Stewart's 2018 interview, his own words about censorship hanging like a shadow. The audience, once a roaring wave of laughter, now buzzed with whispers, their faces a mix of shock and uncertainty. Karoline's hazel eyes stayed steady, her hands folded in her lap, the silver ring on her right hand catching a glint of light. She felt her pulse, not racing now, but steady, like a drumbeat. She'd struck a blow, and the room felt it. But she knew this wasn't the end. Truths like this needed time to settle. Jon Stewart, his face flushed, tried to regain his footing. "Okay, Karoline, nice clip," he said, his voice thinner, lacking its usual bite. "But you're cherry-picking. That's not the whole story." He waved a hand, as if dismissing the evidence. But his note card stayed untouched, his fingers twitching. The audience didn't laugh this time. A few leaned forward, their eyes flicking between Stewart and Karoline, waiting for her response. She didn't shout or smirk. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle. "The truth doesn't need editing, Jon." The words landed softly, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. For a moment, there was nothing, no cheers, no jeers, just the hum of the studio lights and the faint rustle of the crowd. Then, from the back row, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was a man, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and a worn jacket, who'd come alone. He'd sat quietly all night, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Now he stood, his applause slow but deliberate. A woman nearby hesitated, then joined. Her hands tentative at first, then stronger. Others followed, a scattered ripple that grew into a wave. Not everyone clapped, some sat stiffly, their loyalty to Stewart unshaken, but the sound was enough to shift the air. Karoline's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of what was happening. She hadn't come here for applause. She'd come to speak for those who'd been dismissed. Like her, like the man in the back row, like the people watching at home. The woman in the front row, the one with the notepad, was typing now, her fingers flying across her phone. Her glasses slipped down her nose, but she didn't care. Karoline caught a glimpse of her screen X, the app buzzing with posts. Karoline Leavitt just turned the tables on Stewart. One read, "Check this clip, Daily Show." Another, "She got him." The posts were spreading, shared by audience members who'd pulled out their phones the moment the clip played. The woman's name, Karoline learned later, was Ellen Harper, a freelance journalist who'd covered media for decades. Her thread was going viral, each post dissecting Stewart's hypocrisy with surgical precision. Karoline didn't know it yet, but Ellen's words were carrying her truth beyond the studio walls. Backstage, Stewart's team scrambled. A producer in a headset hissed into a walkie-talkie, "How did we miss that clip?" Another, younger, shook his head, his eyes wide. "She's not just some staffer. Who is she?" A young intern, the one who'd been fetching coffee all night, stood frozen, her hands clasped. She'd been invisible to the crew, but now her eyes were on Karoline, bright with something like hope. Karoline felt the shift, subtle but real. The room wasn't Stewart's anymore, not entirely. Her ring glinted under the lights, a reminder of Tom Hargrove's words. Truth waits, but it doesn't hide. She'd waited, and now the truth was out, spreading like wildfire. Stewart cleared his throat, his grin forced. "Let's move on," he said, shuffling his note cards. "Karoline, you still haven't answered about those signal leaks." He was trying to pivot, to drag the conversation back to his turf, but his voice betrayed him, a slight quiver at the edges. The audience murmured, some nodding, others frowning. The man in the back row sat down, but his eyes stayed on Karoline, as if willing her to keep going. Ellen Harper kept typing, her thread now at 10 posts, each one shared hundreds of times. Karoline's phone, still in her pocket, vibrated softly. She didn't need to check it to know what was happening. The clip was everywhere, and with it, her name. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you, when the crowd you thought was against you starts to listen, you'd know why Karoline's hands stayed still. She wasn't here to gloat or to claim victory. She was here to stand for something bigger, something that went beyond one interview. The applause had faded, but the whispers hadn't. The intern backstage shifted, her shoulders straighter now. Ellen's fingers paused, her eyes meeting Karoline's for a fleeting moment. It looked like a win, but Karoline knew better. One clip wasn't enough to change a narrative. Stewart was wounded, but not down. The real test was coming, and it would ask more of her than she'd planned to give. What was she holding back, and would she use it? The Daily Show's studio in New York City felt like a held breath. The sleek black stage, a silent witness to a moment no one had expected. The lights burned hot, casting sharp shadows, and Karoline Leavitt sat at the center, her navy blazer slightly creased, her blonde ponytail still neat despite the tension. The screen behind her was dark now, but the echo of Jon Stewart's 2018 clip lingered, His own words about censorship, a wound that wouldn't close. The audience, once a wall of laughter, sat in a restless hush. Their murmurs a low hum of doubt. Karoline's hazel eyes stayed fixed on Stewart, not with triumph, but with a quiet resolve that seemed to anchor the room. Her hands rested in her lap, the silver ring on her right hand catching a faint glint. She felt her heart swell, not with pride, but with the weight of what she'd done. She'd spoken a truth, and it was reshaping the air. Stewart's face reddened, his jaw tight as he fumbled for words. "You think one video proves anything?" he snapped, his voice sharp but brittle, like glass about to crack. He leaned forward, pointing a finger, trying to reclaim the stage. "You're dodging. Karoline, you're still not answering for your party's leaks." But his confidence was fraying, his hands betraying him as they gripped the edge of his desk. Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, almost soft. "It proves you're not who you pretend to be, John." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. The audience, once his loyal allies, shifted in their seats, their faces a mix of confusion and dawning realization. A few nodded, their eyes narrowing as they looked at Stewart anew. The woman in the front row, Ellen Harper, the freelance journalist, was typing furiously on her phone, her glasses slipping down her nose. Her thread on X was growing, each post linking Stewart's past statements to Karoline's evidence. Her words sharp and unrelenting. Stewart's built a career on calling out hypocrisy. She wrote, "But tonight," Karoline Leavitt held up the mirror. The thread was exploding, shared thousands of times, with Karoline Stewart trending across the platform. Karoline didn't know it yet, but her clip was being dissected in living rooms, bars, and newsrooms, a spark that was catching fire. She felt the weight of her phone in her pocket, vibrating softly with notifications she hadn't checked. She didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was moving faster than she'd imagined. Backstage, the chaos was palpable. A producer in a headset muttered to a colleague, "We didn't vet her enough. Who the hell is she?" The colleague shook his head, his eyes wide. "She's not just some staffer. She's got people talking." A young intern, barely 20, who'd spent the night fetching coffee and staying invisible, stood in the shadows, her hands clasped tightly. She'd been silent all evening, but now she nodded at Karoline, a quiet gesture of respect that no one else saw. Her name was Mia, and she'd grown up watching Stewart, believing in his wit, his moral clarity. Tonight, she wasn't so sure. Karoline's calm, her refusal to shout or gloat, had cracked something in Mia's certainty. She wasn't alone. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a hum of voices that carried questions. A man in the back row, the one who'd clapped first, leaned forward, his gray hair catching the light. His wife, sitting beside him, whispered something, her hand on his arm. They'd come expecting a show, a takedown, but now they were witnesses to something else. Karoline felt their eyes, not as a weight, but as a connection. She thought of Tom Hargrove, her mentor, his raspy voice telling her, "Truth doesn't need volume, it needs courage." She'd carried his ring, his lessons, into this moment, and now she faced a choice. She could stop here, let the clip do its work, and walk away with a small victory. Or she could push further, reveal the other files on her phone, more clips, more evidence that would bury Stewart's credibility. The first option was safe. The second was a risk that could cost her everything. Stewart tried to pivot, his voice strained. "Let's talk about something else," he said, forcing a grin. "Karoline, you're young. What's your endgame here?" He was grasping, trying to shift the narrative, But the crowd wasn't following. A woman in the third row, who'd laughed loudest earlier, sat silent, her arms crossed. The intern, Mia, shifted, her eyes bright with a question she couldn't voice. Ellen Harper paused her typing, her gaze flicking to Karoline, as if sensing the moment's weight. Karoline's chest ached, not from anger, but from the responsibility she carried. She wasn't here to destroy Stewart. She was here to show that truth could stand without shouting, that a small-town woman with a ring and a file could change a conversation. The climax wasn't her words, it was the room's realization, the slow unraveling of a myth. If you've ever faced a moment where silence felt safer than speaking, you'd know why Karoline's hands stayed still. She could feel the tide turning, the crowd's doubt, the world beyond the studio waking up to her truth. But she also knew the cost of going further. The files in her pocket could end this, but they could also make her a target, a lightning rod for anger she hadn't sought. The air was tense, the laughter gone, replaced by a silence that felt alive. Stewart's eyes darted to his producers, his grin fading. Ellen's fingers hovered over her phone, waiting. Mia's nod lingered in the shadows. The segment was almost over. But the choice wasn't. Would Karoline play the rest of her hand, or let the truth she'd already spoken carry the day? The Daily Show's studio in New York City grew quiet as the segment drew to a close. The sleek black stage now a silent witness to a battle no one had foreseen. The studio lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the polished floor, and Karoline Leavitt sat still, her navy blazer slightly rumpled, her blonde ponytail catching a faint glow. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Jon Stewart leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, his face unreadable. For the first time in years, he was silent, his usual quick wit absent. The audience, once a roaring tide of laughter, sat in a hushed reverence, their murmurs barely audible. Karoline exhaled, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, the silver ring on her right hand glinting softly. Her hazel eyes glistened, not with triumph, but with a quiet relief that came from carrying a truth to its end. Karoline's chest ached, a deep, familiar pain that wasn't about Stewart or the crowd. She thought of Tom Hargrove, her mentor, who'd given her the ring before he passed. "You'll know when to use it," he'd said, his voice rough but warm. Tom had believed in her when no one else had, teaching her to fight with facts, to stand for those who couldn't. He hadn't lived to see this moment, but she felt him here, in the weight of the ring, in the courage she'd found. The clip she'd played, Stewart's own words advocating censorship, had done its work, not through anger, but through the quiet strength Tom had instilled in her. The audience hadn't just seen a debate, they'd seen a woman from a small New Hampshire town hold a giant to account, and it had changed something fundamental in the room. Ellen Harper, the journalist in the front row, stood and approached Karoline as the cameras cut to commercial. Her notepad was tucked under her arm, her glasses still slipping down her nose. She extended a hand, her grip firm but kind. "I'm writing about you," she said, her voice low but steady. "You didn't just win, Karoline. You changed the story." Karoline's throat tightened, her eyes burning as she shook Ellen's hand. She wanted to say something, but the words caught, tangled in the memory of Tom's pride, of the people who'd trusted her to speak. Ellen's words were a balm, a reminder that this wasn't about her alone. It was about every person who'd been dismissed, who'd been told their voice didn't matter. The man from the back row, the gray-haired one who'd clapped first, made his way to the stage as the crowd began to disperse. His jacket was worn, his face lined with years, but his eyes were bright. He stopped in front of Karoline, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for speaking for us," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to say it." Karoline's eyes met his, And for a moment, she saw her father in him, another small-town man who'd taught her to stand tall. She nodded, unable to speak, her hand brushing the ring. The man turned and walked away, his wife waiting for him at the aisle, her hand slipping into his. Their quiet gratitude lingered, a warmth that settled in Karoline's chest. Online, the world was catching fire. X was ablaze with Karoline vs. Stewart. The clip shared tens of thousands of times. Conservatives hailed Karoline as a hero, their posts filled with pride. She took down Stewart with one move. Others, less partisan, debated Stewart's legacy, questioning the man they'd once seen as untouchable. News outlets were picking up Ellen's thread, her sharp analysis framing Karoline as a new voice, not just a staffer, but a force. Karoline's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She didn't need to. The truth had done its work, spreading beyond the studio, beyond her control. And that was when the truth didn't need to shout anymore. It was loud enough on its own. Backstage, the mood was grim. Stewart's producers huddled, their voices low and urgent. "We need to spin this," one said, his headset dangling. "This can't be the narrative." The young intern, Mia, stood apart, her eyes still on Karoline. She'd grown up idolizing Stewart, but tonight had cracked that image. Karoline's calm, her refusal to gloat, had shown Mia something new, a way to fight without losing yourself. Stewart himself stayed seated, staring at the desk, his note cards untouched. He'd underestimated her, thought her youth and small-town roots made her an easy mark. Now, he was the one exposed, his credibility wobbling under the weight of his own words. Karoline stood, smoothing her blazer, her hands steadier now. She felt the eyes of the remaining audience, some curious, some admiring, some still skeptical. She didn't care about their judgment. She'd come here for the people who'd been silenced, for the ones who'd sent her messages, who'd prayed for her strength. The clip was a victory, but it wasn't the end. There were more files on her phone, more truths she could share, but she'd chosen restraint, not because she feared the backlash, but because she wanted the focus to stay on the issue, not on her. Ellen lingered nearby, typing again, her thread now a call for accountability in media. Mia took a step forward, then stopped, as if wanting to speak but unsure how. If you've ever carried a truth so heavy it changed you, you'd know why Karoline's eyes glistened as she stepped off the stage. She'd stood her ground, not for revenge, but for those who'd been dismissed like her. The studio was emptying, the lights dimming further, but the moment wasn't over. Ellen's article would hit tomorrow, and the man from the back row would tell his friends. The world was listening now, but what would Karoline do next? Would she keep fighting? Or let this moment stand as enough? Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the Daily Show's studio into the chilly New York night, the city's hum a stark contrast to the charged silence she'd left behind. The air bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her navy blazer tighter, her blonde ponytail swaying as she walked. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket, a cascade of notifications she hadn't checked. She didn't need to. The weight of the evening clung to her, not as a burden, but as a quiet warmth. She crossed the street, her steps steady, and slipped into a small diner on West 46th Street, its neon sign flickering softly. The place was nearly empty, just a waitress wiping the counter and an old man nursing a coffee in the corner. Karoline slid into a booth, ordered a black coffee, and stared at the silver ring on her right hand. Its scratches told a story of Tom Hargrove's lessons, of battles fought, of truths carried through fire. The diner's warmth seeped into her, loosening the tension in her shoulders. She traced the ring's edge, thinking of Tom, her mentor, who'd believed in her when she was just a kid from Atkinson, New Hampshire, with big dreams and a stubborn heart. You don't need to shout, he told her, his voice rough from years of chasing stories. Just stand still and let the truth do the talking. She'd done that tonight, on a stage where Jon Stewart had expected an easy win. The clip she'd played Stewart's own words advocating censorship had shifted the room. The crowd, the world beyond. It wasn't about destroying him. It was about showing that a small-town woman, dismissed as a Gen Z Trump doll, could hold a mirror to power and make it flinch. Her coffee arrived, steam curling in the dim light. She wrapped her hands around the mug, the heat grounding her. Outside, New York moved on, taxis honked. Pedestrians hurried, but inside, time felt slower, softer. Karoline's hazel eyes drifted to the window, where her reflection stared back. A little tired, a little older than she'd felt that morning. She thought of Ellen Harper, the journalist who'd shaken her hand, promising to write her story. She thought of the man in the back row, his quiet, "Thank you for speaking for us," echoing in her mind. Their words, their trust, were why she'd come here, why she'd risked everything, not for fame, not for revenge, but for the people who'd been told their voices didn't count, who'd been laughed at for who they were, online. The world was still reeling. X was a storm of posts. Karoline Stewart trending for hours. Conservatives called her a hero, their messages brimming with pride. She showed them others, less aligned, debated Stewart's legacy, their words tinged with unease. News outlets had picked up Ellen's viral thread, her sharp prose framing Karoline as a new voice in a fractured media landscape. Talk shows were already dissecting the Karoline moment, some praising her restraint, others questioning Stewart's silence. Stewart's team had issued a vague statement, something about context and complexity, but it rang hollow. His credibility wobbled, not shattered, but dented in a way that wouldn't fade soon. A small policy shift followed. Networks vowed to vet guests more thoroughly. A quiet nod to Karoline's impact. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Karoline didn't gloat. She pulled out her phone, not to read the messages, but to type a single post on X. Speak truth. Even when it's hard, she hit send and set the phone face down. Its screen dark. The waitress, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, glanced at her, curious but kind. "You look like you've had a night," she said, refilling Karoline's coffee. Karoline smiled, a small, tired curve of her lips, something like that. She didn't need to explain. The truth was out there, spreading in ways she couldn't control, touching people she'd never meet. That was enough. She thought of Mia, the intern who'd nodded at her from the shadows. She'd seen something in Mia's eyes, hope, maybe, or a spark of courage. Karoline hoped Mia would carry it forward, that she'd remember a woman who fought without shouting, who won without gloating. She thought of her own future, the doors this moment might open, the storms it might bring. She'd chosen restraint tonight, holding back the other files on her phone, not because she feared the backlash, but because one truth was enough to shift the narrative. The world kept turning, but something had changed, something small but real. If you've ever felt unseen, ever wondered if your voice could matter, this moment was for you. Karoline sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth steadying her. The diner's clock ticked softly, marking the hours of a night that would linger. She wasn't a hero, not in her own eyes. She was just a woman who'd stood still and let the truth echo. The loudest truths don't need a stage. They need someone brave enough to carry them, to set them free. As she paid her bill and stepped back into the cold, Karoline felt the ring's weight, Tom's voice in her ear. The city stretched before her, vast and alive. What would tomorrow bring? Only time would tell. Karoline's coffee cup sat empty. its steam long gone. As the diner's neon flickered outside, she slipped the silver ring back onto her finger. It scratches a silent map of courage. The city hummed beyond the glass, unaware of the truth she'd set free. Did justice always need a spotlight, or just one steady voice? Sometimes, the loudest truths are the ones spoken softly, carried not by crowds, but by those who dare to stand still.